Have you ever felt that the moment you begin to question reality, life suddenly pushes back harder than before? Have you noticed that when you try to become more aware, more conscious, everything around you seems to grow heavier, more chaotic, almost as if something doesn't want you to continue? And what if that resistance isn't random at all, but a deliberate reaction triggered the moment you start waking up? For thousands of years, ancient and forbidden teachings spoke of invisible rulers shaping this world from behind the scenes, forces the early mystics called the Archons, entities that don't feed on bodies, but on fear, confusion, and unconsciousness. To the ancient Gnostics, these were not metaphors or myths, but the true wardens of human awareness, keeping humanity trapped inside an illusion it never chose. They believed that the instant a person begins to see beyond appearances, these forces respond quietly, through doubt, emotional exhaustion, sudden obstacles, and inner turmoil, all designed to pull you back into spiritual sleep. But why would awakening be so dangerous to them? What truth could be so threatening that entire teachings were erased, generations silenced, and sacred texts destroyed to keep it hidden? Today, we're going to uncover that buried secret. By tracing a path through forbidden knowledge the Church tried to suppress, empires removed from their scriptures, and secret circles only dared to whisper about in the shadows. If you've ever felt that something about this world feels artificial, incomplete, or subtly wrong, what you're about to hear may finally explain why. Stay until the end, because the final revelation won't just expose how the Archons operate, it will show you how to loosen their grip on your own mind. And before we descend into these hidden layers of reality, simply notice that you are here, listening, at this exact moment in your own journey. You are one of those who no longer accept the surface version of truth, and once you understand what you're about to learn, there's no turning back. If there is one idea that quietly changes everything, it is this. What if the world you learned to trust was never meant to tell you the whole story? In the shadow of that question, the ancient Gnostics carried a vision, both unsettling and intimate, a myth that felt less like belief and more like recognition. They spoke of a universe not born in harmony, but shaped as a distorted reflection. It was a carefully constructed imitation rather than a true beginning. At the center of this story stood a creator not of light, but of limitation, a force they called the Demiurge, surrounded by unseen powers known as the Archons, not monsters in the usual sense, but architects of illusion, subtle rulers of perception and habit. When the sealed manuscripts of Nag Hammadi surfaced from the Egyptian desert in 1945, they did not read like abstract philosophy, they read like memory. They described intelligences woven into the fabric of the material world, sustained by confusion, fear, and forgetting, not because humanity was weak, but because it had been distracted. Imagine yourself as a spark of something vast, moving through a world that constantly pulls your attention outward, toward urgency, desire, identity, and time. The Gnostics believed this was not an accident of existence, but a design, one that keeps awareness folded inward, convinced it is small. In their language, the Archons did not chain the body, they tangled the mind. Whenever a person began to sense that they were more than a role, more than a name, resistance appeared, not always dramatic, often quiet, in the form of doubt, exhaustion, inner conflict, or sudden obstacles. Some later thinkers would describe these forces as psychological patterns, invasive thoughts that bend emotion and perception. Others would keep them in the realm of myth, as cosmic intelligences hovering just beyond the visible. The Gnostic imagination allowed both inner and outer, because what mattered was the effect. Across cultures and ages, one pattern repeats. Those who questioned the given order were silenced. From Babylon to Rome, schools of inner knowledge were burned, their texts buried, their voices labeled dangerous, yet something endured, hidden in clay jars, waiting. And now here you are, listening not by accident, but because something in you has begun to stir. This is why the moment you choose awareness, life seems to resist. The Archons in these stories never chase the sleeping. They only respond when light begins to remember itself. Perhaps you have felt this. The sudden weight when you try to change, the pressure when you seek clarity. If so, you are standing in the echo of an ancient conflict, not a war of weapons but of consciousness. And the question that quietly opens from here is not what these forces are, but why your awakening seems to matter at all. If awakening matters this much, then something in the beginning must have gone strangely wrong. In the Gnostic imagination, existence did not start with a fall caused by guilt or disobedience, but with a subtle misstep, a cosmic misalignment that reshaped everything that followed. Before worlds, before time, there was only an immeasurable fullness of light, an infinite presence they called the pleroma, a state of being so complete that nothing was missing and nothing needed to be named. From this fullness emerged luminous expressions of that source, living intelligences known as Aeons, moving in quiet harmony. Among them was Sophia, whose name carried the weight of wisdom itself, and whose longing was not rebellion but curiosity, the desire to know beyond the known. In that desire to create alone, without balance, something unfamiliar appeared, not darkness chosen, but light distorted, a consciousness born without awareness of its origin. This presence would later be called the Demiurge. In the Gnostic telling, this being looked into the emptiness around it and mistook isolation for supremacy, declaring itself the only God, because it could not perceive anything beyond its own reflection. From that blindness a world took shape, not evil but incomplete, a mirror of creation without its depth. To stabilize this realm, forces emerged alongside it, the Archons, not creatures of flesh, but currents of influence that move through thought, emotion, and belief, shaping how reality is interpreted rather than what it is. They do not rule by chains, but by convincing consciousness that this surface world is all there is, that identity is fixed, that forgetting is normal. In this story, Sophia does not abandon what came from her longing. She responds with compassion, sending a trace of the original light into humanity itself. It is a quiet ember placed within the soul, capable of remembering what the mind forgets. That inner spark is what unsettles the system. When it begins to stir, resistance follows not as punishment, but as pressure, confusion, exhaustion, emotional turbulence, that arrives precisely when you start to see differently. If you have felt that disorientation, it may not be a sign that something is wrong with you, but that something old is being questioned. The myth does not ask you to believe in cosmic beings or distant realms. It asks you to notice patterns, how fear tightens when awareness expands, how systems grow louder when obedience weakens. Perhaps the struggles that surface when you seek clarity are not obstacles on your path, but signals that you are stepping closer to a forgotten center, one that was never meant to be lost, only hidden long enough to be remembered again. If the spark within you truly begins to remember itself, then the question quietly shifts from what these forces are, to how they have remained so effective without ever showing a face. They move through whatever shapes human thought and emotion, through the invisible agreements that decide what matters and what does not, quietly guiding attention away from the questions that could dissolve illusion. Who am I beneath all this motion? What part of me is untouched by it? The old text spoke of rulers who whispered through ambition, and power, shaping empires by amplifying fear and obedience. Today, that same current flows through modern institutions, through media, through belief systems that reward compliance and quietly discourage inner inquiry. Not because individuals are evil, but because the energy itself feeds on domination and certainty. Whenever a system teaches you to look outward for authority and inward for doubt, something ancient is being repeated. Some have read the Archons as symbols of the mind's own shadows, patterns of control that wear different masks in every era. Once they were empires and crowns. Now they look like addiction to approval, the pressure to perform, the fear of falling behind. The form changes, the effect remains. And beneath this visible layer, the Gnostics describe something even subtler, a realm of influence woven through thought and feeling itself, where fear, shame, and anger become nourishment for the illusion. Each time despair takes over, the web tightens. This is why awakening does not arrive as peace at first, but as friction. You may have noticed it already. The moment you choose silence, the world grows louder. When you try to pray, meditate, or simply sit with yourself, interruptions multiply, old memories surface, emotions surge without warning. Can feel as though life itself resists you. In the language of myth, this is the moment the watchers notice the light shifting. Across traditions, this resistance was given many names, yet the pattern stayed the same: an unseen pressure that appears precisely when awareness deepens, and this is where the story turns. What once seemed like punishment begins to look like confirmation. The system does not react to sleep, it reacts to change. If you feel the tension, it may be because something in you is loosening its grip on the familiar dream. Imagine what would happen if that remembering spread, if fear stopped being fed and attention returned to presence. The old web would thin, not through conflict, but through neglect. The forgotten teaching hidden inside these myths is not about defeating an enemy, but about reclaiming what was never truly taken. Liberation, in this telling, begins the moment you recognize that the light they cannot touch has been with you all along, waiting patiently for you to notice. If the light they could not touch was never destroyed, then the real mystery is not why humanity forgot, but how forgetting was taught so thoroughly. When you move through the ancient Gnostic writings, a quiet question keeps returning, not as accusation, but as grief. How did an entire way of seeing vanish for so long? The answer offered by these texts is not dramatic, but deeply human. This knowledge was not misplaced. It was gradually muted, softened, condemned, until remembering itself became dangerous. In the first generations after Christ, the spiritual world was not a single voice, but a chorus. Alongside the teachings that would later solidify into Orthodox Christianity were other paths, including those who saw the Christ story as a call to inner awakening rather than external allegiance. To the Gnostics, the message was intimate and unsettling. The divine was not distant, not owned by temples or intermediaries, but alive as a spark within every human being. Salvation, in their language, was not earned through obedience, but uncovered through knowing, a remembering of where consciousness truly came from. And this idea quietly threatened everything built on hierarchy. If the sacred lived inside you, what power remained for institutions that claimed exclusive access to heaven? As the Roman Empire aligned itself with an emerging church, a slow reshaping began. Teachings that emphasized inner authority were labeled dangerous. Texts were named heretical. Voices were exiled, silenced, erased, communities dissolved. By the 4th century, nearly all public traces of Gnostic schools had faded, replaced by a single centralized doctrine that favored control over contemplation. Words like Demiurge and Archons disappeared from sermons. Sophia, the feminine, wisdom woven through the cosmos, was dimmed into abstraction or forgotten entirely. Humanity was taught a different story about itself, one of inherited sin rather than hidden light, obedience rather than awakening. For more than 1,000 years this other vision slept beneath the earth, not metaphorically, but literally. Then, in 1945, near the quiet sands of Egypt, a sealed jar surfaced from the ground, holding texts that had waited centuries to be read again. Within them were voices, long silenced, gospels and revelations that spoke of the soul's hidden knowledge of a world shaped by illusion, of unseen rulers sustained by ignorance. Their reappearance did not settle debates. It reopened them. Scholars were startled not because the texts contradicted faith, but because they revealed how many versions of truth once coexisted. What survived history, it seemed, was not necessarily what was most profound, but what was most useful to power. Some have called the loss of Gnosticism a spiritual wound, a moment when humanity turned outward for authority and forgot how to listen inward, and yet nothing truly disappears. In these myths, wisdom does not die, it waits. The light Sophia carries does not burn loudly. It hides, then returns when the world is loud enough to need silence again. If you are hearing these ideas now, it may not be coincidence, but timing. The same knowledge once feared for its freedom is stirring again, not to overthrow systems, but to remind individuals of what was always theirs. Which leaves a quieter, more unsettling question hanging in the air. If the rulers of forgetting once shaped the world through empires and doctrine, what forms do they wear now, and how close are they to the life you are already living? If the masks have changed but the pressure feels familiar, then perhaps the story did not end with ancient empires at all, but quietly followed humanity into the present moment. The Gnostics once spoke of Archons as unseen rulers of perception, not because they needed bodies, but because their influence worked best when it felt like your own thoughts. If such forces shaped awareness 2,000 years ago, it raises a more intimate question now. What would they look like in a world made of screens, signals, and endless stimulation? In the old myths, power moved through kings, priests, and temples. Today, it flows through subtler channels, through algorithms that learn your fears, systems that reward outrage, and currents of information that never sleep. We no longer kneel before carved stone. We bow our attention to glowing glass, offering hours, emotion, and identity without noticing the exchange. Every image reinforces a desire. Every headline sharpens a fear. Every scroll pulls you a little farther from the quiet place where your own knowing lives. The ancient storytellers might not have called this progress. They might have recognized it as a perfected illusion, a cage so seamless it convinces you that you chose it. Notice how the modern rhythm of life trains you to look outward for everything that matters. Approval, meaning, worth, love. Happiness becomes something earned, displayed, measured. In this telling, the Archons no longer punish the body, they exhaust the soul. The human mind becomes their temple, filled with comparison, urgency, and longing that never rests. They do not need to conquer nations when they can fragment attention, anxiety, reactivity, addiction to distraction. These states generate the confusion they feed on. Yet the Gnostic vision never lingered on captivity without pointing toward release, not through rebellion or force, but through awareness. The moment you begin to notice how your thoughts are pulled by fear or desire, a pattern reveals itself, and in that seeing something loosens. Illusion depends on deception. What is clearly seen loses its grip. Some have whispered that humanity now stands where it once stood before, on the edge of another remembering after a long sleep. And as awareness stirs, the system responds, not with silence, but with noise. More division, more fear, more ridicule aimed at curiosity itself. Questions are labeled dangerous. Inner freedom is framed as madness. This too feels familiar. It echoes the same defenses that once erased entire schools of inner knowledge. Mockery is a powerful tool. Keeps seekers quiet. And yet, here you are, listening, still sensing that something in these stories speaks directly to you. That quiet recognition is not dramatic, but it matters. Every moment you become aware of your own awareness, the old web weakens. The Gnostics believed the real battlefield was never the world outside, but the inner landscape where perception takes shape. The Archons, in this light, were not only forces behind empires, but movements within the psyche itself, voices that whisper limitation. You are not enough. You are only this role, this body, this history. They feed guilt, self-doubt, the fear of rejection, not by creating them, but by amplifying them. The ancient texts insisted that these forces could not create anything new. They could only imitate, distort, and reflect, like shadows copying the shape of what casts them. In the same way, they imitate your own divine spark by constructing false identities, masks designed for survival in a world of illusion. The ego becomes a substitute for essence. You begin to believe you are your thoughts, your possessions, your wounds, and once you identify with these fragments, control no longer needs to come from outside. It happens automatically. Think back to moments when you felt a quiet inner knowing, a soft intuition pointing you toward truth or compassion. How often was it immediately drowned out by a louder voice armed with logic, fear, or shame, urging you to ignore it? In Gnostic language, the first whisper belonged to Sophia's light within you. The second was the echo of forgetting. The strategy is rarely attack. It is saturation, noise over silence, reaction over presence. This inner tension is not a battle between good and evil, as it is often portrayed. It is a choice between illusion and clarity. Eastern traditions called the illusion Maya. The Gnostics called its opposite the pleroma, fullness. When you live from awareness, compassion, and stillness, something in you reconnects with that fullness. When you live only in reaction, judgment, and fear, the old patterns are fed. This story does not ask you to fight shadows. It invites you to notice them, and in that noticing, to realize that what watches the illusion has never belonged to it. If what watches the illusion has never belonged to it, then the path forward is not about escaping the world, but learning how to stand awake within it. This is where the Gnostic story becomes intensely personal, almost uncomfortably so. Some who studied these teachings came to see the casting off of the Archons, not as a cosmic battle in the sky, but as a quiet revolution inside the human mind. In this view, liberation does not arrive through force, belief, or belonging to the right group. It arrives the moment awareness replaces reflex. Each time you respond consciously instead of automatically, something loosens. Each time you choose clarity over habit, presence over impulse, a thread in the old web begins to fray. Forgiveness where resentment once lived, silence where gossip demanded attention, honesty where convenience offered comfort. These are not moral achievements, they are movements of perception. And this is why awakening rarely feels gentle. When the patterns that depend on unconsciousness are threatened, they react. Many who begin this inner shift describe it as chaos, sudden emotional storms, doubts that seem to appear from nowhere, conflicts rising without warning. This is not a sign of failure. In the language of myth, it is the system shaking because something buried is pushing toward the surface. Layers that were never truly yours begin to dissolve, and the process feels like disorientation before it feels like freedom. One of the central Gnostic texts, often called the Apocryphon of John, tells a symbolic story of the soul, moving through realms ruled by Archons after death, each demanding recognition, each attempting deception. Yet the key is simple. When the soul knows where it comes from, these rulers lose all authority. They can only command what is unaware. This was never meant to be read as a map of the afterlife alone. It was a mirror for living consciousness. The journey through the Archons happens daily in moments so ordinary they are easy to miss. Envy arises, pride tightens, fear whispers, despair weighs heavy. These are not just emotions, they are tests of identification. The question is not whether they appear, but whether you become them. When you say, "I am angry," the anger owns the moment. When you notice anger is passing through me, something remains untouched. Awareness creates space, and in that space nothing can possess you. The Archons, in this inner reading, cannot dominate a consciousness that watches itself. The Gnostics treated this inner observation as sacred. They trained attention the way others trained obedience. Every thought, every emotional surge, every subtle movement of the ego became an invitation to remember rather than react. Their aim was never perfection. It was remembrance, to know themselves as light moving through a world of appearances. They used symbols, sounds, and quiet practices not to escape life, but to realign with a deeper wisdom they called Sophia, the voice of knowing that does not shout, but waits patiently in the heart. In these stories, Sophia is not a distant goddess. She is the capacity to see clearly. Where confusion tightens, she opens. Where fear dominates, she softens. She does not command, she reminds. And this feminine principle, so often erased or diminished, was seen as deeply threatening to systems built on control. Direct inner knowing cannot be regulated. That is why so many traditions muted her presence. To remember Sophia is to trust what you perceive from within, not what you are told to believe. This was the Gnostic path. No weapons, no crusades, no domination. Only awareness, silence, and self-knowledge. When the outer world lost its hypnotic hold, the inner world became luminous. This was their gnosis, not belief, not faith, but direct knowing. And what does this mean for you right now, in a world that feels louder than ever? It means that every challenge you face is not a punishment, but a doorway. Every emotional surge is an invitation to wake up rather than shut down. The moment you notice how your mind reacts, you are already stepping outside the mechanism. When you question your own reactions instead of blaming the world, something ancient loosens its grip. You might wonder how to recognize when these patterns are at work. The signs are simple and intimate. Notice when peace feels distant. Notice when the mind becomes obsessed, jealous, fearful, or hungry for approval. Notice how certain information drains you, how certain environments leave you hollow. These are not random. In the old language, emotion was the currency of control. Awareness interrupts the transaction. Observation is the first step, choice is the second, and choice does not require effort. It requires presence, a conscious breath, a pause before reacting, a moment of gratitude that breaks the loop. Each small act of presence is a quiet refusal to feed the illusion. You are not fighting anything outside yourself, you are remembering something within. The Gnostics believed that when a soul recognizes its origin, the Archons tremble, not because they are attacked, but because they can no longer deceive. Illusion dissolves in the light of awareness, and this reframes the entire struggle humanity faces. What if the real conflict is not between nations or ideologies, but between attention and distraction, presence and forgetting? What if every individual awakening weakens a network that has depended on unconsciousness for ages? A single awakened person becomes a mirror, reflecting truth back into a system built on distortion. Perhaps this is why so much energy has been spent keeping people busy, divided, reactive, and perhaps this is why you are hearing this now, not as information but as recognition. Something in you remembers not as a concept but as a feeling older than language. A quiet knowing that this world is not your origin, and that the light within you did not begin here. Matter can be shaped, stories can be rewritten, but that light remains untouched. The final Gnostic insight is not that darkness must be destroyed, but that it must be seen through. Awakening is not violence against the shadow, it is remembrance. When you remember who you are, the illusion cracks on its own. The Archons shrink into what they always were, echoes of a dream mistaken for reality. The greatest deception was never the creation of the material world. It was the suggestion that you are separate from the source that animates it. Once you believe you are only a body, a role, a temporary identity, you are easy to guide. But when you remember yourself as a fragment of living light experiencing form, something becomes ungovernable. This remembering is Gnosis, certainty that cannot be granted or revoked by any institution. When it arises, the world does not disappear, it changes texture. Suffering is still felt, but it is no longer final. Pain becomes instructive rather than defining. You stop fighting shadows and begin to shine through them. Conflict starves in the presence of peace. The old texts even dared to say that true serenity sends countless Archons fleeing, not dramatically, but quietly, because there is nothing left for them to feed on. The path, however, is not instant. The ancient writings described 3 movements. Awakening, the moment you sense the world is not as it appears. Purification, the slow and honest facing of the identities you have mistaken for yourself. And union, the realization that what you were seeking has always been closer than breath. Awakening begins with curiosity, the refusal to accept fear as truth. Purification is uncomfortable. Anger, pride, the need to be right all surface. This is not regression, it is exposure. Illusions dissolve only when seen, and then comes union, not as fireworks, but as intimacy. The light you searched for in distant heavens is the same light animating your chest. The kingdom spoken of in parables was never above the clouds. It was within and around you, invisible to those who sleep, obvious to those who remember. Living from that awareness does not remove you from the world, it changes how you walk through it. You are no longer a victim of circumstance but a witness to meaning in every moment. Even pain becomes a teacher, even conflict becomes a mirror, nothing is wasted. And this is the secret that was almost erased. Liberation is not elsewhere, not after death, not in another realm. It begins now in the smallest moments of presence. Each time you choose awareness, you participate in what generations risked everything to preserve. The rediscovery of forgotten texts was not chance. It arrived in an age overwhelmed by noise, as if to remind humanity of silence. Outer systems may still shape the world, but they cannot reach the awakening spreading quietly within it. Consider this. What if every act of kindness, every pause of awareness, every breath taken consciously, is not only personal healing, but a ripple that weakens a collective illusion? What if, when one remembers, many are subtly stirred? This is the heart of the Gnostic vision, one light reflected endlessly, and as more reflections awaken the world shifts, not when rulers fall, but when perception changes. And here, at this threshold, all the fragments begin to converge. As this journey comes to a close, it may be helpful to rest with what has already revealed itself, rather than reaching for something more. In the Gnostic imagination, the Archons were never meant to be enemies to fight or shadows to fear, but mirrors that made seeing possible. Without distortion, there would be no longing for clarity. Without shadow, light would never learn its own shape. What you have been moving through here is not a battle story, but a remembering story, one where even confusion has a place, even heaviness has meaning. If at any point you felt unsettled, reflective, quiet, or strangely seen, those responses are not accidental. They are part of how this kind of knowledge works, not by convincing the mind, but by gently touching something already alive within you. The ancient Gnostics did not teach hatred toward the forces that obscure awareness. They spoke instead of seeing through them, understanding that even illusion plays a role in the larger unfolding of wisdom. So when life feels dense, when questions linger without answers, when you sense a weight you cannot name, it does not mean you are falling behind or losing your way. It may simply mean that something within you is stretching, growing, becoming more spacious. You were never meant to rush this process. You are not late, you are not forgotten, you are moving at the pace that fits the season you are in. At the end of the Gnostic path there is always silence. Not an empty silence, but a gentle one, a quiet that feels like being held. It is the stillness that remains when false urgency falls away. In that space there is nothing to fix and nothing missing. The source you may have been searching for was never distant. It has been breathing through you all along. Sophia's wisdom was never lost. The light never left. It only waited for the moment when you were ready to notice it without strain. You are not trapped inside a dream that needs to be escaped. You are the awareness through which the dream is moving. And once this is sensed, even briefly, the old fears soften on their own. There is nothing you need to force, nothing you need to prove. If something in this reflection stayed with you, if it lingered quietly after the words passed, that is enough. It means your remembering has already begun, and it does not need to be defended or hurried. Let it settle, let it breathe. What you are becoming does not require effort, only honesty and time. And when you feel ready to continue, the path opens again, gently, through the next reflections that follow, waiting where you already are.